Hello, friends. Thanks for spending a little time with us again tonight. My name is Jim Chancellor. I'm with the American Veterans Collection, and we're a not-for-profit little organization that works with bettering the lives of our veterans. Do a lot of work with PTSD, immoral injuries of war, and we have a special guest tonight, Kristin Marlow, and she's been involved in the Red Cross forever, and now she's just jumped over to Habitat. And I have some questions for her about where the Red Cross fits in compared to combat, compared to natural disasters. But before we begin, I'd like to have her introduce herself.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jim. Kristin Marlowe. I spent 7 years as an executive director with American Red Cross, and just stepped away to focus on affordable housing initiatives, especially post-disaster. Those folks that are displaced, that's the biggest pinch point for folks in recovery, and particularly veteran housing. They are one of those vulnerable populations. So to be able to focus on that, I came back to my roots of Habitat. I've been with Habitat for about 18 years. I currently serve as the board president, but just have this opportunity to try and help navigate and start some conversations around some of the needs there. So I think my Red Cross background and what I saw in deployments will certainly help me navigate that uncertain path. But thanks for having me.
Sure. The main question, most people know that I was a door gunner in Vietnam and saw combat almost on a daily basis. And they know that I do a lot of work with moral injuries and PTSD and how trauma causes that. Can you tell me a little bit about how the Red Cross really got started and what their role was in war compared to what it is in like natural disasters and things around the world?
Yeah, for sure. So the American Red Cross started from a visit. Most folks know that Clara Barton started the American Red Cross in the late 1800s, but it came from a visit that she made overseas from the Franco-Prussian War back in 18. Gosh, I'm going to probably butcher the year. I think about 1861, but 1859. A gentleman by the name of Henry Dunal actually was in Italy, and the Battle of Solferino lost about 40,000 individuals in that conflict. And what he saw, he was only traveling through the area, and what he saw was a lot of folks wounded and being left to die on the battlefields because nobody would walk into that area of conflict for fear of being injured, for fear of not knowing what to do. So he actually kicked off the initiative of we have to have neutral, impartial parties that are in a position to be able to serve those in battle. And where the Red Cross came, it actually started the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is the ICRC over in overseas, which actually wrote and penned the Geneva Convention. And what Clara Barton did was bring that back here to the United States and say we needed to have that same type of opportunity for folks wearing that red cross to be viewed as neutral and impartial, to go onto the battlefield and to tend to those folks that were injured and or deceased at time of battle. She also started up a program to help families back home identify where their loved ones were, because a lot of folks went off to war and never returned, and
Right.
the mental anguish of not knowing what happened to your loved one in the service.
Did
So
did the
that
Red Cross actually act as nurses on the field?
So the volunteers, the Red Cross has always been a volunteer labor force. There are some folks, of course, that manage the program overall on the operations, but 95% of the folks for the Red Cross have been and continue to be volunteers. Now you have everyone from disaster health and disaster mental health. But back then, you had a lot of folks that were working at home rolling bandages. You had folks that were carrying. Back then, you had the manual gurneys. You needed four hands and two people, one on each end, to carry folks off on the gurneys off the battlefield. So you didn't necessarily have to be trained as a nurse. Depending on the size of the conflict, it could be all hands on deck. And the people that showed up were the ones that were given instruction, and they had somewhat almost like an MP badge around their arm. They had
I
a
re
Red Cross um, insignia that they tied around their arm to let folks know that if they were on the battlefield, they were not to be harmed because they were there to help protect and serve and support those injured in conflict.
Is this a worldwide effort? Other countries recognize
Ev-
and have their own Red Cross system, or?
Every country has a Red Cross. We have the American Red Cross here, which handles everything domestically, and then also things like the areas, the properties that we own as Americans, which would be the Puerto Rican area, the Guam area. Um, there's other properties. I'm missing one
No,
off the
that's
top of
okay.
my head, but
That's all right.
U.S. Virgin Islands. There we go. That's another one that a lot of people forget that we're in charge of supporting as Americans.
Now, when you were active with the Red Cross, you were deployed 17 times. Is that correct?
Yeah, I lost count after a bit. So what the American Red Cross does is we deploy and we support every disaster. That could come in the form of a single house fire, where we support the family and show up to serve their needs, their immediate needs. Or it can be things like floods and fires and tornadoes and hurricanes and typhoons and mudslides and all of those types of things. We're in the process of all of those combined right now. We have active disasters in many areas across the country, but we're paying a lot of attention right now to Milton going through Florida, and the tornadoes that's spinning up. We've still got mudslides and things over in North Carolina. So every natural disaster, the Red Cross is serving and supporting the folks that are most affected.
The PTSD that I talk about all the time, my brain is still cloudy because I try to understand, everything that might trigger PTSD, and it's not just war related, but it's PTSD is brought on by fear base, and a lot of people didn't actually engage in combat, but they saw the after effects of combat, which affected them emotionally, mentally, and sometimes physically. Now, you might not even believe that there's a level of the same thing, but are there people from the Red Cross that suffer from PTSD because of their deployment?
We see it a lot. We have a program called Disaster Mental Health, and they are volunteers that are state licensed and work in that capacity. But they not only support the folks, the clients, the survivors, the individuals that have been affected by the natural disaster or whatever the disaster was, but then they also work to support the staff and the volunteers, because it does get very taxing. When I was in Lahaina for the wildfires in Maui, I landed just a couple of days after the event happened, and there were still so many people looking for family members. And typically, in a disaster situation, we may call them clients. This was a collective group of survivors, which is it seems like a simple word change, but it really sets the tone for the level in which this response um, impacts the people, not just the ones that are working the disaster, but the folks that are left behind for sure. So it's hard sometimes to support the folks that are affected the most um, when you're unclear of what they're facing. I haven't lost a loved one in this disaster. How do I support them best? And you go in day one with the highest of hopes, but every day you're hearing difficult stories, and every day you take the weight of what those survivors and those clients are carrying home with you, whether you want to or not.
Well, of course,
It
of course.
goes home with you, and you can do great work while you're there. But I have yet to have gone home from a deployment, from a disaster deployment, um, feeling like I always go home feeling like I should do more and I should have been able to do more. And so we have folks, the Red Cross has folks that
Well,
really pay close attention to that.
yeah, I think that's in your DNA to help. Training, or do you just throw on a red T-shirt and you're a volunteer, or there's training and
That's a great question. It depends on the work that you want to do, and where you want to serve. So obviously, some of the training, we have volunteers that are disaster health um, responders and disaster mental health responders. They're both professionally trained. They're nurses and doctors and um, uh, counselors and mental health professionals that are licensed that give up their time at home to go serve in that capacity. So that role, we work under a incident command and a concept of operations or a ConOps platform. So the operations on a disaster with the Red Cross is very similar to a military deployment. So we have a um, executive order and we have incident command, and there are processes to be followed. So depending on what role you're assigned on the disaster, there certainly is training involved, because we have to make sure that we're not only working well together, but working with the best interest of the client in mind.
One more question, and we'll go to habitat, which
Yeah.
we're both very, very passionate about. Uh, Different responsibilities between war and disaster? I mean, what role does the Red Cross try to play the same role?
It depends on, so yes, the goal of the Red Cross is to alleviate human suffering, and to be
Ah, well
neutral and
said.
impartial to alleviate human suffering. And so, one of the roles and one of the branches with the American Red Cross is the Service to the Armed Forces program. And with that, we have folks that deploy for 6 months at a time, and they are in forward facing active military zones, and they are working nonstop to take care of and support all of the folks that are deployed in that area. So they could be in Djibouti, they could be in Romania. They're going through extensive training to deploy and serve as the Red Cross on that military base. Back here at home, we have a whole group of volunteers that walk through the entire um, lifespan of a veteran from the time they enlist to end of days. There is a portion of the Red Cross that serves and supports if that veteran needs that. From entering their MEPS card to make sure that we know how to connect with these families should something happen, or they need to get that critical communication out, or get in touch with a commanding officer to get information for that individual that's deployed, to the No Veteran Dies Alone program, making sure that someone is there bedside if it's necessary and needed. So it continues through the veteran's life. The training that's received for all of those categories also is shown in every one of the shelters that is open, every one of the deployments, and all of the work on the ground, because we don't know the client that we're talking to and the survivor that we're talking to may be a military veteran. They may have somebody deployed now and they're struggling with that on top of everything else. We don't know their level of trauma, where it came from, if it came from service in the military or if it came from a childhood issue. So the training is very accommodating to the needs of the client, regardless of whether it's military or non-military. A lot of the approach is the same.
My only experience with the Red Cross was in Vietnam in 1970. I got shot down in the helicopter on April 21st, and thank God everybody survived. But I didn't write home for 4 or 5 days, and there was an article in our local paper that said I was shot down. And when my mother hadn't heard from me, she called the Red Cross. And the next thing I knew, I was in the office and he was telling me that, you better communicate with your family
Better
a
call
little
your
bit
mother.
better. Yeah, you call your mom. But thank God that's my only experience. Now, Habitat for Humanity, I mean, when you said you came home, that's exactly what you came home here to try to solve a problem. It's one at a time. And I talked with Wendy this morning a little bit about, and it's not just new houses, but you're trying to implement maybe a rehab program, or you have all types of opportunities at different stages and levels, don't you?
We do. And so again, one of the reasons to step back and come home to Habitat, I've been involved with Habitat for about 18 years now. And so there's an opportunity there, but it also happens to be it was the biggest level of frustration. Every deployment I was on for the Red Cross, there was a challenge to return folks to what we would consider their pre-disaster environment. So how do we move these folks from displacement back to a recovery position? And sometimes you have unhoused or chronically unhoused individuals, and moving them along that continuum of housing may mean that we just need to replace the items to make sure they're comfortable where they are going to continue to be unhoused. Some folks don't want to recover in a manner, or they can't at the particular time recover in a manner that would allow them to go into more stable housing. regardless of what that individual's situation is, we have an affordable housing inventory crisis in this country right now. And the disasters that we are seeing with Helene just 10 days ago and Milton coming through right now, that really greatly reduces the number of affordable housing units. And, there's a term that people used to use that says living high on the hog. That was a thing. And the premise there was the higher you went in the cut of meat on the
Oh,
hog, the more
wow.
expensive that was. The same pertains to elevation when it comes to certain areas of the country. So the higher the level, the sea level, the more expensive the housing is. So what you find is the areas very often that flood the fastest and flood first are those areas where folks are just barely getting by. They're really struggling. They don't have that nest egg or that cushion in the bank that's going to allow them to recover from any kind of flood damage. And when they get displaced, it very, very often can throw them into a lifelong cycle of poverty. So, the need to have affordable housing inventory post disaster for recovery for folks that are in the middle of what a lot of folks, hundreds of thousands of people right now are potentially facing being displaced by these tornadoes and these hurricanes. But veterans face that every day when they come home, and they're struggling to find their place. And what are some of their challenges? So um, the veterans happen to be a vulnerable population that we know we can do better supporting. But what does that affordable housing initiative look like to get them across that continuum of housing care from either unhoused or inadequate housing to home ownership is the habitat model. Habitat model isn't we're gonna stop and leave you in a affordable rental. The goal of habitat is to break the cycle of poverty through affordable housing home ownership and give them that lifelong stability.
I talked to some friends before we came on today and told them you were coming on, and they asked me a question I couldn't answer. They said, when there is a disaster and Red Cross goes in, do they build homes for?
The Red Cross does not. Most organizations, the affordable housing inventory, one, it's a lengthy process. It takes time and it's a lot of money. We know the
Do they
cost
have
of
temporary?
construction. So the organizations like the Red Cross would set up temporary shelters, emergency shelters, temporary shelters. And then they have something called shelter resident transition. That's a process to say, what means do you have available to you to rehouse? Do you own a home and can it be fixed? Does the rental you were in have available units that you can move into? Do you have family to stay with in the meantime? So transitioning these folks that are in these emergency shelters to their next level of recovery is very, very challenging. And it's a process that the Red Cross takes very seriously, but it's not something that they can own. That's something that is a collective, collaborative partnership. So I don't know. Some people have heard the term. We're very familiar with it, but it's disasters start locally and end locally. So when something happens, you need to build the resilience of your community for 72 or 96 hours because we may not have first responders coming sooner than that, depending on the scope and the size of that disaster. And then what's some of the recovery that's going to be available at the end when some of those larger organizations are on to larger natural disasters somewhere else. So
When
what can we do as a community?
when uh when a veteran is down and out and they make that first call and they're in some type of temporary situations where they're struggling both financially and with employment and things like that. Do you have a circle of professionals that you work with where you could address all of the issues that a veteran might have?
So we don't know as Habitat you're speaking
Yes.
or yeah, so I can speak on the behalf of Habitat and the Red Cross on that one is both organizations while they are specialists in their space. It takes a community to do those
Oh,
wraparound
sure,
services
sure.
and the need to be collaborative and the need to mobilize a community around how and who can serve and support that veteran. That is what is often missing when we have organizations that are working in a silo rather than working in a collaborative effort. So The desire is there to get to that point, but neither organization is a one-stop shop. They really require and need that collaborative community engagement that comes with sitting down at the table and having a conversation that says, okay, what does a housing task force look like? Who needs to sit at the table? And you may not think that a certain area of mental health support would be part of a conversation when it comes to housing, but it absolutely has to be. And because the individuals that are coming in, closing and buying that house and starting off on their opportunity to stabilize their family through home ownership, they're going to have some challenges. They're going to
Sure.
have some
Sure.
needs there, along with financial counseling. How do we make sure we're building a budget? They may not. Most of the Habitat families have never had a budget built, and many don't have a standard bank account.
Yes, I've had some experience with that. I started a not-for-profit in Gary, Indiana. It was called On Common Ground, and I had a lot of rental properties in Gary, and a lot of almost all of the people would get their check, they would pay 2% to cash it. They would ride the bus down and pay their NIPSCO bills with the cash, and they didn't understand banking at all. And I was working with a bank that to try to educate the homeowners on this. And he said, "Well, we'll teach them how to do 401s." And I'm like, "No, you don't understand. That this, we got to talk about a basic checkbook."
Mhm.
And so when you got a young couple that is in that position and you offer them financial guidance, maybe not through the Red Cross, but through your partners, then tell me about that first home. Tell me, they have to work in it,
Yeah.
or
So through Habitat, we actually, one of the requirements is they do go through the financial peace course that talks about building a budget and reducing their debt and getting them more fiscally stable, as well as, that next level. Wouldn't it be great when we get to that next level of what does the investments look like? How do we save for, a car breakdown or things like that so it doesn't
oh,
throw us into turmoil?
this is not good. Can you cut that?
So they do go through that process, and then they also are responsible for what we call sweat equity hours. Sweat equity means that they're going to work for the opportunity to have a zero interest mortgage and have that home ownership opportunity. Just last week, we have a great partnership with the Home Depot and the Home Depot Foundation, and we did a veteran build in the parking lot of the Hammond store off of 165th.
With
And
Amy.
what's that?
With Amy.
Yes, it was fantastic, and it was the whole district. So we had folks from Illinois, we had store managers as far out as Bridgeview, and I can't remember where some of the other stores were, but it was just a great turnout. And it was to build the walls for a veteran family. And while the veteran was not able to be there and be on the job site doing the hammer work that day, her children were.
Oh boy.
And so her 3 children were there helping build the walls. And so, yes, there's sweat equity that's involved. You definitely have skin in the game
Yep.
when you have something like that. And then there's a small down payment that's minimal, but again, it's a requirement. And then it's a zero interest mortgage. So it's an opportunity for someone to be able to break that cycle of poverty, keep their kids in a school district, get to know their neighbors. That social cohesion of neighbors helping neighbors is so impactful and such a critical piece of that building resilience. And when we talk about veteran housing initiatives, being able to put veterans in communities with other veterans, that social cohesion piece is going to be just priceless.
That neighborhood feeling is kind of drifted away from us.
Yep.
And I'd love to have America look like it did on September 12th in 2001 with the thousands of flags all over the place and the support we had for each other. But perhaps we can get back to that. I'm not exactly sure, but I'll always work towards that. Transitional housing. We're going to run out of time before I get to talk about everything I wanted to talk about. But, with my little not-for-profit, when a storm is coming in the wintertime, there'll be people call me. There'll be homeless veterans call me and they say, "Jim, just get me off the street. I don't want to hear about your programs. There's a storm coming. I just need you to get me off the street." And a lot of times I will. But they're not interested in bettering their lives. And rather than the American Veterans Collection having to brunt that financial responsibility. Is there anything in the works with Habitat for Transitional Housing where people could get temporary housing, just whenever it might be needed?
Well, it's definitely part of the conversation. I don't know if it would be a whenever it might be needed, because the transitional housing that is part of the Habitat conversation right now is when those veterans are identified that are going to be a part of the Habitat Partner Family Program, and they need housing for the time frame in which it takes to build theirs. But I will say that's one of the reasons why these housing task force conversations need to take place, because collectively, all of the folks and all the voices at the table, solutions can be found. I I don't know what that looks like. Magic wand, I would love to be able
No,
to tell you I
that's
know what that looks like. We know it's necessary. We know it's needed. The challenge is, like you said, who funds it and who manages it, but
tons of logistic
collectively,
problems. Yeah.
yeah, collectively, um, we also need to talk a lot more about it. We're not having conversations. The conversations are coming when the phone rings and everybody struggles and says, "Oh, I don't know. Is there a shelter there? What do we do?" We need to be a lot more proactive and start doing some significant planning for what transitional housing will look like.
And that's what we're going to do on the 16th, correct?
Correct.
There's a group of people going to address the issues, and it'll be a solution-based conversation, I'm
Yes,
sure,
sir.
because we're not really interested in rehashing the problems. We all are very much aware of the problems. But Habitat made inroads this morning with Judge Cantrell in the Veterans Treatment Court.
Wendy was
And
very excited to represent and be there.
yeah,
That's fantastic.
she did a great job and handed out some applications, and she also got some volunteers that will work with us too. So we're about to wrap up. So what else have you got to? I mean, I have 1,000 other questions. Perhaps I can have you come back.
Definitely. I would love, so if I can wet the whistle a little
Sure,
bit, what I'd
go
love
for
to
it.
come back and talk about, because I brought up Veterans Treatment Court on a Habitat for Humanity International call around honor builds and veteran builds. And there's a exciting opportunity with the HUD VASH program,
Mhm.
the Housing for Urban Development, and the VA. The VASH is Veteran Affair Supportive Housing. And how do we get veterans to be able to use VASH vouchers for home ownership rather than rental, getting them out
That
of
would
that
be key.
rental cycle? That's the conversations we're having here for Northwest Indiana, for the Habitat I serve and support.
Yes, another one that I like to discuss at a different time is that you don't sell to the secondary market, and if a veteran breaks an arm and has some trouble, that you have the ability to work with them.
We work with all of our partner families. Our goal is to keep them in their homes and to make sure that all of the work that they put in to break that cycle of poverty through affordable home ownership, they get to reap those benefits their entire life.
Yeah, there's a lot of lenders that don't care if you break your arm.
That is correct.
They just want to get paid. And I'm so happy that you took the time to come up here and talk with us, and hopefully we can do this again.
Happy to. Thanks, Jim.
Education is the key.
It is.
Education,
Collaboration,
opportunity.
education. We need to talk.
Thank you.